I'd like to thank Liberty Villages and Greg Rowe for sponsoring this conference. And it's always encouraging to me to meet people at these events and to find some kindred spirits. And it's enjoyable to me to talk about what I've devoted my career to, which is higher education. I teach at a small liberal arts college in South Carolina with about 1,800 students. Though I have to say that higher education today is in dire straits, as you might have picked up from Dr. Jewell's talk a few minutes ago. The November 2024 issue of The Atlantic has an article by Rose Horowitz, which describes one of the problems we're facing. It's entitled, "The Elite College Students Who Can't Read Books." And she says, Nicholas Dames has taught literature humanities, Columbia University's required great books course, since 1998. He loves the job, but it has changed. Over the past decade, students have become overwhelmed by the reading. College kids have never read anything they're assigned, of course, but this feels different. Dames' students now seem bewildered by the thought of finishing multiple books a semester. His colleagues have noticed the same problem. Many students no longer arrive at college, even at highly selective elite colleges, prepared to read books. She says this development puzzled Dames until one day during the fall 2022 semester, when a first-year student, we used to call them freshmen, came to his office hours to share how challenging she had found the early assignments. Literature humanities often requires students to read a book, sometimes a very long and dense one, in just a week or two. But the student told Dames that at her public high school, she had never been required to read an entire book. She had been assigned excerpts, poetry, and news articles, but not a single book cover to cover. She goes on to say Anthony Grafton, a Princeton historian, said his students arrive on campus with a narrower vocabulary and less understanding of language than they used to have. Jack Chen, a Chinese literature professor at the University of Virginia, finds his students shutting down when confronted with ideas they don't understand. They're less able to persist through a challenging text than they used to be. So I'm going to focus here on higher education, even though clearly there are some problems from K through 12 that are kind of migrating into my sphere. And we could certainly spend a lot of time talking about K through 12. But I subtitled this short talk, Why We're Spending More and Getting Less in American Education. And to understand that, I think we have to go back and look at some of the history of higher education in the United States and the government involvement in that. The Morrill Land Grant Act was the first of the major interventions which established a lot of the land grant institutions in each state, such as my alma maters, Clemson University and Auburn University. If you want to read, thank you, War Eagle. If you want to read more on that, I recommend the chapters by Jane Shaw Stroup and Richard Vedder in Todd Zawicki and Neil McCluskey's book, Unprofitable Schooling. Then we have the GI Bill that funded the post-World War II expansion of higher education, the 1958 National Defense Education Act that established the Perkins loans that basically subsidized interest rates for student loans. We had a massive expansion of federal involvement in higher education with the 1965 Higher Education Act. In 1975, we got Pell Grants, which today account for tens of billions of federal dollars flowing into higher ed. And then in 2010, what was called the Healthcare and Education Reconciliation Act, which nationalized the student loan process. Lending and collecting are under the Department of Education. And in the 13 years following that 2010 legislation, student loans doubled. Real spending per student has increased over the long term, as you can see in the chart on one of the charts on the handout that I've got at the tables there. We are now at more than 3 times the spending levels of before World War II, and that's adjusting for inflation. That's spending per student. Federal student financial assistance is sharply higher in recent decades, especially with increases in the 1990s and the early 2000s. Some of that may be due to the fluctuations, like Dr. Jewell was talking about the waves of population of 18 to 22-year-olds, our prime demographic that are coming through higher ed. But as I mentioned, a lot of that is student loans. The government has been throwing money at higher education, and the response has been that a lot more people are going to college that otherwise may have found other pathways. And so we have about $1.7 to $1.8 trillion in student loan debt right now, an average student loan balance of about $38,000. Now the median may be lower, but the average is about $38,000. About 92% of that is federal. And as money has been thrown at higher education, the colleges and universities have simply increased their spending and increased tuition. Whether it's really been beneficial to students is not clear. You can see on your handout that tuition has gone up much faster than ordinary inflation, especially since the early 1990s, right when total federal student loan assistance was rising. Now, people have this idea I sometimes run into where they say, well, colleges are more expensive and therefore we need more federal aid to help pay for that. But I think they have the cause and effect reversed. I think what's happened is that the more money government threw at colleges and universities, the more those institutions raised their prices. And you can see that the cost of college has been rising relative to median household income, so it's become less affordable. From a norm of around 8 to 12% of median household income in the 1970s and 80s to over 25% by the beginning of the last decade. And College Board information has shown recently that average tuition and required fees at a public four-year institution required over 40% of median household income by 2022. For a private nonprofit institution, 137% of median household income. And I don't have that chart in your handout, but I'll put that in the PowerPoint. There's a QR code at the end of the handout, and I'll be posting some of my notes there if you want to look up some of this later. William Bennett, the former Secretary of Education, said in 1987 that increases in financial aid have enabled colleges and universities blithely to raise their tuitions. And recent research has borne this out. Nicholas Turner, in a 2012 article in the Economics of Education Review, found that, quote, intended cost reductions of tax-based federal student aid are substantially offset by institutional price increases for a sample of four-year colleges and universities. He says he found that tax-based aid crowds out institutional aid roughly dollar for dollar. So where's that leave the student? Stephanie Cellini and Claudia Golden in 2013 said that they found that the Title IV institutions, which are eligible to participate in higher federal student aid programs for higher education, they charge tuition that is about 78% higher than that charged by comparable institutions that are not eligible for federal financial aid. Another 2017 study said that they found, Gordon and Hedlund found that the demand side shocks, that is the expanded student loan availability, caused tuition to jump by 91%. If you look at all the other changes except those, then you only get an increase in tuition of about 14%. So where's the money go? College administrations have no shortage of ideas on that. A lot of it has been to create a kind of a spa-like environment on a lot of college campuses, dormitory improvements, campus amenities, and administration. Richard Vedder's great book, Restoring the Promise, revealed that Princeton University spent $136 million on a student dorm with, quote, leaded glass windows and a cavernous oak dining hall. He said that the dorm's cost approached $300,000 per bed. Since 2000, NYU has provided, quote, $90 million in loans, many of them zero interest and forgivable, to administrators and faculty to buy houses and summer homes on Fire Island and the Hamptons. Lavish perks for senior higher ed administrators. And a few years ago, Vedder pointed out that, quote, private planes are becoming increasingly common at U.S. colleges and universities. Some schools spend millions of dollars a year flying their coaches and executives on scores of trips around the country, and some pass the cost on to students and taxpayers. That college administrator got his own jet airplane. We then need to ask, what is it exactly that students are getting out of higher ed? Are they gaining knowledge and skills? Are they maybe signaling a work ethic and higher order thinking? Or are they simply consuming some kind of consumption good? So first, let's look at that higher knowledge and the analytical ability that we professors always hope that they're getting. It's not actually clear that they're getting that. A recent study or survey showed that 60% of managers believe that recent college graduates lack critical thinking and problem-solving skills. The handout has a chart there with the results of a CLA Plus test that was administered across about 5 or 6 different countries. Most of the respondents were in the United States. And they administered this test of things like critical thinking, job skills to year 1 students, and then to students who were exiting after 4 years. And what they found is, I mean, you can see on the chart that entering students, about 57% are not proficient in these various skills. About 2% come in at the top tier, very proficient. And exiting students 4 years later, that non-proficient percentage has dropped to 47%. So that's a decline of 17.5% in non-proficiency. But does higher education even deserve credit for that little bit? And I think there are a couple of questions we should ask. Number one, we have a pretty significant dropout rate between year 1 and year 4. Now, some of those are very talented individuals, and I've talked to some in this room that dropped out, and they've made great success of their lives, and that's wonderful. I mean, you get Bill Gates, who dropped out of Harvard, and whatever you think of Bill Gates, that's indisputably been pretty successful at what he does. And so you do get that phenomenon, but anecdotally, I would say that the majority of those who are dropping out between year 1 and year 4 are not the Bill Gates of the world, and not those that have those abilities, that they're just wasting their time in finishing out their college degree, but students that didn't have those skills necessary to complete those 4 years. And we know that the 6-year college graduation rate for first-time, full-time undergraduate students in the U.S. is about 64%. That is, after 6 years, 64% graduate, and the other third or so do not after that time. So my question is then, do you get some survivorship bias here? That is, that decline from 57% to 47% in non-proficiency might be because those that drop out tend to be those that did not have those skills to make it through. And so that alone might explain part of that decline in non-proficiency. That is, those in that orange or yellow part of that diagram drop out at a greater frequency than those in the top 3 bands. The second question I'd ask is, well, you've got an 18-year-old, 4 years later that person's going to be 22 years old, and normally you'd see some increased maturity, you'd see some, no matter what they're doing almost, that student would be gaining proficiency in some skills. It could be, on the job training, it could be an apprenticeship, could be all kinds of things that student is that person is participating in, and you would expect that you would get some decline in those non-proficiencies as a result of pretty much any 4-year period in that person's life. So again, for us to, in higher ed, to say, well, we're responsible for that improvement in that student's proficiency is not necessarily the case. We might be taking too much credit, maybe a lot more credit than we should be taking for any improvement that we are seeing in that 4-year span. So let's turn to that second possible function of higher education. What if higher education is simply a kind of an arms race? And by that I mean, what if college education is partly an investment in relative standing? So it's more about how much you have relative to somebody else rather than the absolute amount that you have. Employers may use educational attainment as a kind of a signal. You're motivated, you're intelligent, you're persevering. And so to simplify it, let's just suppose the top 50% most educated, formally educated, get good jobs, and the bottom 50% get bad jobs. So then if the bottom 50% is getting more education, that means those that are more motivated, more persevering, more intelligent have to get even more education to try to make sure that they stay in that top 50% if higher ed is being used by employers as a proxy for those valuable skills and traits. Now, increasingly, I think employers are starting to look beyond how many pieces of paper do you have that testify that you sat in class for however many years, and they're starting to look at some other things. Maybe it's becoming a little easier to measure those traits apart from looking at whether somebody has a sheepskin from a prestigious university. But what is happening, I think, as a result of the flood of money coming in from US taxpayers is that people may be investing more in those years of higher education than would really be necessary. My grandfather on my mother's side got to 8th grade and quit, and that was it for him. And that was not terribly unusual for his age group. But he did very well in life. He was a success, and he did that without higher education. Now I know today's different, and we have certain career tracks that may require more higher education, but maybe we've gone too far in that direction. We're over-investing in higher education. So formal education may still pay off for a lot of people, and I'm not suggesting that it can't, but I think some people are risking expending considerable resources and time for little benefit. Some majors, as we know, may pay the same tuition, but get lower financial returns. There's especially a problem with those who drop out, who may not be those super talented individuals who can make a success out of themselves, regardless of whether they have a degree, when they're done. But we have some students that borrow a lot of money, and it's being encouraged that they borrow a lot of money, go to college, and maybe they get 2 years in and they just say, this is just not something I can see through to the end. They drop out. They got 2 years worth of college education that they have to pay off, but no sheepskin. And there is a very definite sheepskin effect. That is, if you don't have the degree at the end, then you are not going to get the same income boost most of the time as you would if you did complete the program. Now, I would argue that there are some non-monetary benefits to higher education. So it's not just about how much you can earn when you get out. There are some other benefits, I think. I won't go into that here. But I think we've got a lot of graduates. Vedder pointed this out in some of the charts that you've got, the black and white charts that you see in the handout that show that we've got a lot of graduates who are getting into jobs that do not require a college education. You've got people who are working as taxi drivers and chauffeurs, firefighters, carpenters, bank tellers, who are paying off 4 years of a college degree. All those student loans, tens of thousands of dollars at least of student loans for a job that did not require what they learned in college. So we're arguably, again, over-investing in college education for people who just wanted to show they're more motivated, persevering, and intelligent than the other applicants. That's all they really wanted to do. And we've diverted so much money into this that it's subsidizing that over-investment. So what about the third possible function of higher education? What if higher education is partly about consumption? Consumption-oriented students might choose colleges and majors that aren't too demanding because there are social opportunities. Courses, in some cases, I think, are thinly disguised entertainment opportunities, which can be taken for credit. And you see students that are kind of selecting, not all students, but some students that are more consumption oriented are kind of selecting those professors that they hear are going to be easier. They select the programs that are just not going to be too challenging. I had a good friend in college who went to Clemson with me, and we were always kind of poking fun at him for his major, and he was a PRTM major at Clemson, which was Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management, which we always said stood for Party Right Through May. Now, I mean, he was a great guy, hard worker. I mean, nothing against him. It's just we had to pick on him because that's what we did. But I mean, undoubtedly, there are students that are looking for the social opportunities and are doing that at taxpayer expense and it's considerable personal expense in a lot of cases. We know that students are spending less and less time on their academic work. Another graph that you have in your handout from Richard Vedder shows very clearly the decline in the time expense, the amount of time that students are spending on their academic work in college and how that's dropped over several decades. I was speaking on the subject at a conference a while back, and a student asked me, well, could this possibly be because they have the internet now to look up sources so that their research goes faster? And I said, well, if you look at the chart, you can see the time commitments going down well before the internet showed up. So that's not it. I mean, still using those card catalogs and those kinds of things. I have little doubt that students are spending less time on research, but I don't think it's because they're just more efficient. We have a real problem today in universities with academic dishonesty. And I think this is also due to this financial incentives the government has created. Every 18-year-old, and a lot of older people too, have a figurative backpack of government money and subsidized loans that can be spent on a college or university. And administrators are therefore incentivized to accept these applicants who have little experience or ability with writing. Furthermore, they have little incentive to vigorously prosecute plagiarism because the student might fail out of the university or be expelled for academic dishonesty, and there goes the backpack full of money. Faculty and GTAs, graduate teaching assistants, have little incentive to create work for themselves by following a bureaucratized academic dishonesty procedure. And increasingly, online formats foster an environment where cheating is low cost. AI has just made this a lot worse. I am grateful, by the way, to be teaching at a small liberal arts college where all the classes are face-to-face. We have no online classes whatsoever. The class sizes are very small. My maximum class size is something like 25 students. And so I know that they're not running ChatGPT while they are handwriting their tests on their blue books. I can check that. I think there might be an advantage to that becomes more obvious as we get further into AI. I came across a post on X by a tech CEO named Greg Eisenberg, and it got, last time I checked, it was over 6 million views, so some of you might have seen this. Eisenberg said, just had a fascinating lunch with a 22-year-old Stanford grad, smart kid, perfect resume. Something felt off, though. He kept pausing mid-sentence, searching for words, not complex words, basic ones, like his brain was buffering. Finally asked if he was okay. His response floored me. Sometimes I forget words now. I'm so used to having ChatGPT complete my thoughts that when it's not there, my brain feels slower. He had been using AI for everything, writing, thinking, communication. It had become his external brain, and now his internal one was getting weaker. Maybe think about calculators. Remember how teachers said we needed to learn math because you won't always have a calculator? They were wrong about that. But maybe they were right about something deeper. We're running the first large-scale experiment on human cognition. What happens when an entire generation outsources their thinking? Don't get me wrong, I'm beyond excited about what AI and AI agents will do for people in the same way that I was excited in 2009 when the App Store was launched. I didn't quite get that, but anyway. But thinking out loud, you got to think this guy I met isn't the only one who's going to be completely dependent on AI. We're seeing some problems, of course, related to AI, but that's not the only thing that's been causing the grade inflation that we've been seeing lately either. And you've got another chart on there with showing the percentage of grades that are A's and percentage that are B's and C's and so on. And you can see the sharp increase in the number of A's over a very long period of time in the 20th century and the early 21st century, so that today, coming up on half of all grades are A's, and B's are a close second. Very few are now C's, D's, and F's. And I would say that partly is due to, again, that backpack full of money that colleges don't want to get rid of. They want high retention, whatever it takes. We have also seen an increase in part-time instructors, which has increased, I think, grade inflation, since part-time instructors on short-term renewable contracts have stronger incentives to get good teaching evaluations, and they can buy those high scores on teaching evaluations by giving out high grades. One study from 2022, which again I'll post in the link at the end, shows that the increase in graduation rates that we have seen over the last 3 decades is driven by grade inflation. So what do? Fundamentally, we are watching a higher ed machine that is extracting far more money than necessary from students and taxpayers and funneling it to yo-yos who work in higher education in one way or another. Many of them are getting money for nothing. Let me tell you, them guys ain't dumb. So I would say, there's a lot of things that we can do. Number one, alumni contributions have been displaced in some ways by that flood of government money, but alumni contributions and alumni voices are not insignificant, and they can still embarrass a college or university by exposing misconduct and gross inefficiency. Social media appears to be gradually throwing off its various silencing tactics so that the worst offenders in higher education are more likely to be exposed. I think we need to encourage the development of new institutions, not dependent on government funds, willing to be tolerant of free academic inquiry, and they need to be equally intolerant of mobs that shut down academic discourse and intimidate administrators into various things. Harassing or firing faculty is one thing that comes to my mind. And there have been prominent cases of this nationwide in the last decade or so. Parents need to be willing to encourage their students in a different direction, not just being overawed by historic prestige, not locked into some kind of athletic allegiance. Instead, willing to do the hard work of looking at where real education is going on today. That could be apprenticeships and some alternatives, as well as being some forward-thinking academic institutions. So talk to parents, talk to current faculty, talk to students, talk to recent graduates, find out if they're sane. Steer clear of institutions that have tolerated shutdowns of academic discourse. Keep your eye on the ball. It's not about the spa-like facilities. It's not about the number of exotic majors or the extracurricular programs. It's about whether the institution is focused on developing timeless traits like intellectual curiosity, analytical reasoning, and virtue. So instead of throwing money away on yo-yos with their jet airplanes, you'll be helping pull higher education back from the brink. Thank you very much.